Một trong những video đáng xem nhất những người quan tâm đến AI của ngày hôm qua và ngày hôm nay, tớ nghĩ là như vậy. Đó chính là một video từ Andrej Kapathy. Anh này thì có một cái profile cực kỳ khủng. Đầu tiên anh là nhà khoa học máy tính người Canada, gốc là Slovakia. Anh là giám đốc trí tuệ nhân tạo AI, tầm nhìn lái tự động của Tesla. Sau này anh ấy là người đồng sáng lập, tức là co-founder, cựu co-founder làm việc tại OpenAI. Bây giờ thì anh không còn làm việc nữa rồi. Mà chúng ta cùng xem cách anh ý sử dụng. Nào, chúng ta sẽ thấy những cái gì. Đầu tiên là anh ấy nói về LLM này. Anh sử dụng thêm cả những cái tool công cụ khác như là Gemini, như là rất nhiều, tôi thấy nhiều lắm. Cursor, hay là anh dùng cả nhiều con, tôi nghĩ là dùng con. Đây, anh đọc, anh phân tích khá là nhiều. ChatGPT, anh nói sâu, anh nói về Grok, về Claude nữa, khá là nhiều. Và video này là 2 tiếng 11 phút. Các bạn cùng ViruSs, tớ nghĩ là hôm nay sẽ là một cái video rất đặc biệt. Tớ sẽ ngồi các bạn 2 tiếng hơn. Tớ nghĩ là tớ sẽ ngồi học luôn. Và để học thì tớ sẽ làm một cái file như này. Tớ muốn mọi người bắt đầu cùng tớ luôn. Và video này sẽ là full Vietsub, là vì sao? Tớ có một cái bảng Vietsub đây này. Đây là một cái phần plugin để dịch tiếng Việt cho mọi người. Mọi người hãy nhìn ở đây nhá. Có gì mọi người không hiểu thì mọi người pause lại nha. Và thường tớ sẽ dùng một cái tài liệu học AI như thế này. Đây, một cái file như thế này. Cho mọi người xem hình này. Đây. Tớ đã học rất nhiều thứ rồi. Tớ sẽ học cái video này ở đây. Và chúng ta cùng nghe và cùng học nhé. Để xem là chúng ta sẽ học những gì. AI học chưa bao giờ là thiếu cả. Đấy. Ok. Các bạn sẵn sàng chưa nhỉ? Hãy chuẩn bị tinh thần. Ngồi 2 tiếng của virus. Các bạn có thể chia ra các cái khoảng thời gian khác nhau để học cũng được. Còn tớ thì tớ học từ đầu cuối luôn.
So in this video, I would like to continue our general audience series on
Anh ấy có một cái hai cái video khá là hay về ChatGPT. Không biết các bạn đã xem chưa? Nhưng mà thôi chúng ta cùng xem cái video này. Tôi nghĩ là video này nó sẽ bao gồm cực kỳ nhiều thứ và thú vị. Kênh YouTube của anh ấy là Andrej Kapathy nhé mọi người.
large language models like
Large
ChatGPT.
language model.
Now, in the previous video, deep dive into LLMs that you can find on my YouTube, we went into a lot of the under the hood fundamentals of how these models are trained and how you should think about their cognition or psychology. Now, in this video, I want to
Đây, mô hình này được đào tạo và các bạn nên suy nghĩ về nhận thức hoặc tâm lý của chúng. Đó.
go into more practical applications of these tools.
Cái video này là đi sâu hơn vào ứng dụng thực tế.
I want to show you lots of examples. I want to take you through all the different settings that are available. And I want to show you how I use these tools and how you can also use them in your own life and work.
Vậy là anh ấy sẽ sử dụng các cái công cụ anh ấy dùng trong đời sống hàng ngày để chúng ta cùng nhau học xem là chúng ta dùng đã tốt chưa, đúng chưa ha.
So let's dive in. Okay, so first of all, the web page that I have pulled up here is chatgpt.com. Now, as you might know, ChatGPT was developed by OpenAI and deployed in 2022. So this was the first time that people could actually just kind of like talk to a large language model through a text interface. And this went viral and all over the place on the internet. And this was huge. Now, since then, though, the ecosystem has grown a lot. So I'm going to be showing you a lot of examples of ChatGPT specifically. But now in 2025, there's many other apps that are kind of like
Khoan, dừng lại đoạn này, mọi người nhìn nha. Ở trên bảng là LLMs in the wild. Tất cả những cái mô hình mà các đọc các bạn nhìn trên màn hình ấy, phần lớn chúng ta đều gọi tắt LLMs, nghĩa là gì? Large Language Model như anh ấy nói ấy. Thì ngày hôm nay có vẻ như anh ấy sẽ dùng nhiều thứ khác nữa nha. Và chúng ta có thể thấy rằng là anh ấy phân định ra là startup, big tech nha. Mọi người nhìn thấy không? Big tech là công ty lớn được đầu tư, ví dụ Gemini là của Google version, Meta AI là của Meta version và Copilot là Microsoft. Còn những công ty nhỏ startup như là Claude này, hay là Grok này, hay là Perplexity, DeepSeek và Lechat đây.
ChatGPT-like. And this is now a much bigger and richer ecosystem. So in particular, I think ChatGPT by OpenAI is this original gangster incumbent. It's most popular and most feature-rich also because it's been.
Vậy là theo anh đánh giá thì ChatGPT là phổ biến nhất này, nhiều tính năng nhất này, và vì nó tồn tại lâu nhất và nó đã có một khoảng thời gian rất là dài rồi. Bây giờ chúng ta sẽ sơ niệm cái chuột của tôi hôm nay nó bị hơi đơ đơ. Đây, tôi sẽ để lên trên để cho mọi người dễ nhìn. Ok.
OpenAI is this original gangster incumbent. It's most popular and.
Cái này tớ nghĩ là tớ sẽ ghi lại luôn. Mọi người có nốt lại luôn nhé. Chúng ta cùng học với nhau. Đầu tiên đó là chúng ta phải nói ngay là ChatGPT. Sẽ đổi cái phông này của tớ. Mọi người hãy mở một cái bản học nhé. ChatGPT thì là by OpenAI và là OG, most popular, quan trọng là most feature rich, rất nhiều tính năng. Đó, tiếp theo là Big Tech. Chúng ta sẽ có Gemini của Google này. Chúng ta sẽ có Meta AI của Meta này. Chúng ta sẽ có Copilot của Microsoft này. Cái này thật ra mình không cần ghi cũng hiểu, cũng hiểu thôi. Nhưng mà thôi, tớ nghĩ là cứ ghi thôi. Coi như là chúng ta nốt lại một bài học. Chúng ta có Claude, Anthropic. Chúng ta có Grok là con XAI, Perplexity. Chúng ta có DeepSeek. Chúng ta có Lechat. Lechat này của Pháp à? Ghi nốt lại mọi người. Biết đâu sau này chúng ta quên thì cái này của Chinese. China đấy mọi người.
Most feature rich also because it's been around the longest. But there are many other kind of clones available, I would say. I don't think it's too unfair to say. But in some cases, there are kind of like unique experiences that are not found in ChatGPT, and we're going to see examples of those. So for example, Big Tech has followed with a lot of kind of ChatGPT-like experiences. So for example, Gemini, Meta AI, and Copilot from Google, Meta, and Microsoft respectively.
Tớ muốn dừng lại đoạn này và giải thích cho những người mới dùng AI đang xem video này nhé. Con Gemini ấy, các bạn xử lý các phần liên quan đến YouTube và liên quan đến những cái như là Google Cloud, Google Meet, các thứ ứng dụng của nó rất là hợp lý tại vì nó là thuộc Google version, nó sẽ có những cái đầu nối đặc biệt hơn Google Studio đấy chẳng hạn. Thì các bạn dùng cho đúng hợp lý nhá. Còn Meta AI thì thôi, tôi chưa test không biết, nhưng mà thật sự tôi test thấy hơi thất vọng với Facebook là ra con AI hơi lởm. Còn Copilot này, mọi người chú ý con Copilot, nó ra con Copilot 365. Anh em nào dùng Excel, PowerPoint mà muốn chuyển đổi số cho doanh nghiệp ấy thì Copilot rất ổn nha, rất ổn. Mọi người, nó ứng dụng thẳng vào trong những cái phần mềm của Microsoft, rất ổn nha. Còn với Claude thì là như tôi đã nói là phân tích file hoặc là code như là làm web hay là làm lập trình hoặc code một cái gì đấy, Python thì đấy. Grok là các bạn lấy dữ liệu từ Twitter, X về rất ok. Perplexity là searching, còn DeepSeek với Lechat không nói rồi.
And there's also a number of startups. So for example, Anthropic has Claude, which is kind of like a ChatGPT equivalent. XAI, which is Elon's company, has Grok. And there's many others. So all of these here are from the United States companies, basically. DeepSeek is a Chinese company, and LeChat is a French company, Mistral. Now, where can you find these and how can you keep track of them? Well, number one, on the internet somewhere. But there are some leaderboards, and in the previous video, I've shown you Chatbot Arena is one of them. So here you can come to some
Hoang, chúng ta sẽ có một cái bảng
boards, and in the previous video, I've shown you Chatbot.
Ok, chúng ta sẽ có một cái bảng leaderboard như thế này để chúng ta có thể check thường xuyên về rank hay còn gọi là arena score. Nó sẽ có những cái tỷ lệ như là tăng giảm, số lượng người dùng, mọi người vote thế nào ra làm sao. Ok, chúng ta sẽ nốt lại cái leaderboard này bằng việc là nốt lại cái trang web của nó. imarena.ai /leaderboard. Okay, we good.
Arena is one of them. So here you can come to some ranking of different models, and you can see sort of their strength or ELO score. And so this is one place where you can keep track of them. I would say like another place maybe is this SEAL leaderboard from Scale. And so here you can also see different kinds of evals and different kinds of models and how.
Vậy là mình sẽ ghi thêm một cái leaderboard thứ hai. Chúng ta có thể check thường xuyên, đó là cái scale.com. Okay, scale.com. Okay.
Well, they rank, and you can also come here to see which models are currently performing the best on a wide variety of tasks. So understand that the ecosystem is fairly rich, but for now, I'm going to start with OpenAI because it is the incumbent and is most feature rich. But I'm going to show you others over time as well. So let's start with ChatGPT. What is this text box, and what do we put in here? Okay, so the most basic form of interaction with a language model is that we give it text and then we get some text back in response. So as an example, we can ask to get a haiku about what it's like to be a large language model. So this is a good kind of example task for a language model because these models are really good at writing. So writing haikus or poems or cover letters or resumes or email replies, they're just good at writing. So when we ask for something like this, what happens looks as follows. The model basically responds, words flow like a stream, endless echoes never mine, ghost of thought unseen. Okay, this is pretty dramatic. But what we're seeing here in ChatGPT is something that looks a bit like a conversation that you would have with a friend. These are kind of like chat
Các bạn hãy dừng lại nếu chưa nghe rõ phần dịch ở tớ để trên này nhá. Những cái về phần LLM mà tớ đã học rồi, cho nên tớ sẽ trôi khá là nhanh. Cái gì tớ cần nhấn mạnh tớ sẽ nhấn mạnh cho mọi người ha. Đây là những kiến thức rất cơ bản về LLM khi các bạn dùng ChatGPT.
bubbles. Now, we saw in the previous video is that what's going on under the hood here is that this is what we call a user query, this piece of text. And this piece of text and also the response from the model, this piece of text is chopped up into little text chunks that we call tokens. So this sequence of text is under the hood a token sequence, one-dimensional token sequence. Now, the way we can see those tokens is we can use an app like, for example, Tick Tokenizer.
Đây sẽ là một cái trang web về chuyện mà chúng ta test thử xem là câu trả lời hoặc câu hỏi chúng ta là nó sẽ tính khoảng bao nhiêu token để thông qua là tức là những cái như chúng ta viết ra và những cái câu trả lời của nó sẽ được tóm tắt thành một cái đơn vị được gọi là token nha mọi người. Chúng ta sẽ vào trang web này để tính token luôn, nó là Tick Tokenizer, tickTokenizer.vercel.app. Ok, đó là thú vị.
So making sure that GPT-4o is selected, I can paste my text here. And this is
Token count là 15 này.
actually what the model sees under the hood. My piece of text to the model looks like a sequence of exactly 15 tokens. And these are the little text chunks that the model sees.
Token hay gọi có thể là mã thông báo để mọi người đọc ở trên hình.
Now, there's a vocabulary here of 200,000 roughly of possible tokens.
Thế cho nên là mọi người sẽ thấy rằng những cái LLM như là họ sẽ công bố là trả lời nhiều nhất được 1 triệu context hay là 200.000 hay như thế nào chúng ta sẽ thấy được các cái phần gọi là sao ta số lượng và đơn vị.
And then these are the token IDs corresponding to all these little text chunks that are part of my query. And you can play with this and update it, and you can see that, for example, this is case sensitive. You would get different tokens, and you can kind of edit it and see live how the token sequence changes. So our query was 15 tokens, and then the model response is right here, and it responded back to us with a sequence of exactly 19 tokens.
Câu trả lời sẽ là 19
So
token.
that haiku is this sequence of 19 tokens. Now, so we said 15 tokens, and it said 19 tokens back. Now, because this is a conversation and we want to actually maintain a lot of the metadata that actually makes up a conversation object, this is not all that's going on under the hood. And we saw in the previous video a little bit about the conversation format. So it gets a little bit more complicated in that we have to take our user query and we have to actually use this chat format. So let me delete the system message. I don't think it's very important for the purposes of understanding what's going on. Let me paste my message as the user, and then let me paste the model response as an assistant. And then let me crop it here properly. The tool doesn't do that properly. So here we have it as it actually happens under the hood. There are all these special tokens that basically begin a message from the user, and then the user says, and this is the content of what we said. And then the user ends, and then the assistant begins and says this, etc. Now, the precise details of the conversation format are not important. What I want to get across here is that what looks to you and I as little chat bubbles going back and forth, under the hood, we are collaborating with the model, and we're both writing into a token stream. And these two bubbles back and forth were in a sequence of exactly 42 tokens under the hood. I contributed some of the first tokens, and then the model continued the sequence of tokens with its response. And we could alternate and continue adding tokens here. And together, we are building out a token window, a one-dimensional sequence of tokens.
Vậy là chúng ta đã hình dung tại sao mà thông qua cái token count này, tớ đã hình dung là tại sao mà cái prompt của chúng ta cần phải càng rõ ràng, càng đưa vai trò, càng đưa môi trường vào càng tốt. Mọi người hiểu ý tôi không? Tức là nó bản chất nó vẫn là xử lý theo dạng chuỗi bubble bong bóng qua lại, cho nên là nếu mà mình đưa cho nó cái cái tự tài thông tin có nhãn dán ấy, tức là hiểu cụ thể từ những từ một đấy. Nó sẽ tốt hơn là chúng ta đưa những cái thông tin mà nằm ở vai trò cá nhân hóa quá. Ê, tớ nói không biết mọi người.
Okay, so let's come back to ChatGPT now.
Ok, quay lại nào.
What we are seeing here is kind of like little bubbles going back and forth between us and the model. Under the hood, we are building out a one-dimensional token sequence. When I click New Chat here, that wipes the token window. That resets the tokens to basically 0 again and restarts the conversation from scratch. Now, the cartoon diagram that I have in my mind when I'm speaking to a model looks something like this. When we click New Chat, we begin a token sequence.
Ok, khi mà chúng ta bấm New Chat thì bắt đầu chúng ta sẽ bắt đầu một chuỗi cả cái context window mà từ đầu đến cuối chúng ta nói liên tục trong cái bảng chat đấy. Ê, tớ nhìn cái này tớ mới hình dung ra thêm về cái sự ảnh hưởng của token cho cả một cái đoạn context window dài ngoằng ấy.
So this is a one-dimensional sequence of tokens. The user, we can write tokens into this stream. And then when we hit enter, we transfer control over to the language model. And the language model responds with its own token streams. And then the language model has a special token that basically says something along the lines of, I'm done. So when it emits that token, the ChatGPT application transfers control back to us, and we can take turns. Together, we are building out the token stream, which we also call the context window. So the context window is kind of like this working memory of tokens, and anything that is inside this context window is kind of like.
Đây chính là lý do tại sao mà một cái cuộc hội thoại từ đầu đến cuối nó sẽ vẫn lưu trữ được toàn bộ những thông tin, ngay cả những câu hỏi đầu tiên của mình. Cả cuộc hội thoại dài ấy.
In the working memory of this conversation.
Và nó sẽ làm việc dựa trên cả những cái token đã ra rồi và những cái câu hỏi, những cái dữ liệu mà chúng ta đã nói chuyện rồi ha.
And is very directly accessible by the model. Now, what is this entity here that we are talking to, and how should we think about it? Well, this language model here, we saw that the way it is trained, in the previous video we saw there are two major stages, the pre-training stage and the post-training stage. The pre-training stage is kind of like taking all of internet, chopping it up into tokens, and then compressing it into a single kind of like zip file. But the zip file is not exact. The zip file is lossy and probabilistic zip file, because we can't possibly represent all of internet in just one sort of like, say, terabyte of zip file, because there's just way too much information. So we just kind of get the gestalt or the vibes inside this zip file. Now, what's actually inside the zip file are the parameters of a neural network. And so, for example, a 1 terabyte zip file would correspond to roughly, say, 1 trillion parameters inside this neural network.
Trillion parameter, 1.000 tỷ tham số.
And what this neural network is trying to do is it's trying to basically take tokens and it's trying to predict the next token in a sequence. But it's doing that on internet documents. So it's kind of like this internet document generator, right? And in the process of predicting the next token in a sequence on internet, the neural network gains a huge amount of knowledge about the world. And this knowledge is all represented and stuffed and compressed inside the 1 trillion parameters, roughly, of this language model. Now, this pre-training stage also we saw is fairly costly. So this can be many tens of millions of dollars, say like 3 months of training and so on. So this is a costly, long phase. For that reason, this phase is not done that often. So for example, GPT-4o, this model was pre-trained probably many months ago, maybe like even a year ago by now. And so that's why these models are a little bit out of date. They have what's called a knowledge cutoff, because that knowledge cutoff corresponds to when the model was pre-trained.
Đúng rồi, cho nên là có một cái mà chúng ta thấy được ngay là khi mà cứ update ra một cái bản model mới thì mọi người cứ hướng tới dùng các model mới. Tại vì là cái knowledge, deeper world knowledge, tức là cái số lượng thông tin được đào tạo trước đấy của nó sẽ lớn hơn rất nhiều. Còn không nó sẽ bị chạm ngưỡng thông tin. Cho nên là con 4 bây giờ chắc là không dùng nữa rồi. Mọi người thấy đa phần không dùng nữa đâu. Mọi người toàn dùng là con 4.5 rồi. Và mọi người sẽ thấy một cái video ChatGPT 4.5 trên kênh được.
And its knowledge only goes up to
Cho nên là các bạn có thể dùng những con tệp mới được train mới, ví dụ con Grok, Super Grok, Super Grok hoặc là con, Claude 3.7 mà Sonnet
To that
mới ra cách đây 3-4 ngày ấy.
point. Now, some knowledge can come into the model through the post-training phase, which we'll talk about in a second. But roughly speaking, you should think of these models as kind of like a little bit out of date because pre-training is way too expensive and happens infrequently.
Hiểu, hiểu, hiểu. Vậy
So any kind of recent information, like if you wanted to talk to your
vậy là vì là đào tạo, trước đấy cho nên là về bản chất thì, các cái thông tin gần nhất thì nó sẽ không bám quá sát, cho nên là chúng ta dùng nên trên dạng chiến lược thì tôi nghĩ là hợp lý hơn ha. Chứ nó không dùng trên dạng, gọi là, hỏi những thông tin real time,
your model about
nên dùng
something
như
that
kiểu
happened last
Perplexity
week
thì
or
có vẻ
so
ổn
on,
hơn.
we're going to need other ways of providing that information to the model because it's not stored in the knowledge of the model. So we're going to have various tool use to give that information to the model. Now, after pre-training, there's the second stage goes post-training. And the post-training stage is really attaching a smiley face to this zip file because we don't want to generate internet documents. We want this thing to take on the persona of an assistant that responds to user queries. And that's done in a process of post-training where we swap out the dataset for a dataset of conversations that are built out by humans. So this is basically where the model takes on this persona and that actually so that we can like ask questions.
Vậy là cái phần post training, tức là tiền đào tạo của nó sẽ nằm ở việc mọi người sẽ thấy được là cái tiền đào tạo này nó sẽ được cộng thưởng thêm cái số lượng data, trong hoặc là cái thông tin mà chúng ta cung cấp cho nó sẽ được đào tạo ngay khi chúng ta cung cấp thông tin cho nó. Và với ChatGPT chúng ta thấy được phần memory là một này, với cái cuộc hội thoại chuẩn tổng thì chúng ta có thể thấy được phần đó là cái context window dài từ đầu đến cuối này. Cho nên tớ vẫn khuyên mọi người là dùng dùng OpenAI, chứ mọi người dùng AI thì nên prompt càng nhiều càng tốt ạ.
And it responds with answers. So it takes on the style of an assistant, that's post-training, but it has the knowledge of all of internet, and that's by pre-training. So these two are combined in this artifact. Now, the important thing to understand here, I think, for this section is that what you are talking to is a fully self-contained entity by default. This language model, think of it as a 1 terabyte file on a disk. Secretly, that represents 1 trillion parameters and their precise settings inside the neural network that's trying to give you the next token in a sequence. But this is the fully self-contained entity. There's no calculator, there's no computer and Python interpreter, there's no World Wide Web browsing, there's none of that. There's no tool use yet in what we've talked about so far. You're talking to a zip file. If you stream tokens to it, it will respond with tokens back. And the zip file has the knowledge from pre-training and it has the style and form from post-training. And so that's roughly how you can think about this entity. Okay, so if I had to summarize what we talked about so far, I would probably do it in the form of an introduction of ChatGPT in a way that I think you should think about it. So the introduction would be, hi, I'm ChatGPT. I'm a 1 terabyte zip file. My knowledge comes from the internet, which I read in its entirety about 6 months ago, and I only remember vaguely. Okay. And my winning personality was programmed, by example, by human labelers at OpenAI. So the personality is programmed in post-training, and the knowledge comes from compressing the internet during pre-training. And this knowledge is a little bit out of date, and it's probabilistic and slightly vague. Some of the things that probably are mentioned very frequently on the internet, I will have a lot better recollection of than some of the things that are discussed very rarely, very similar to what you might expect with a human. So let's now talk about some of the repercussions of this entity and how we can talk to it and what kinds of things we can expect from it. Now, I'd like to use real examples when we actually go through this.
Ok,
So for
xem
example,
ông
this
hỏi thử
morning
một
I
cái
asked
prompt này.
ChatGPT the following. How much caffeine is in one shot of Americano? And I was curious because I was comparing it to matcha. Now, ChatGPT will tell me that this is roughly 63 milligrams of caffeine or so. Now, the reason I'm asking ChatGPT this question, that I think this is okay, is number one, I'm not asking about any knowledge that is very recent. So I do expect that the model has sort of read.
Đây là vấn đề, tức là vẫn phải nhấn mạnh lại đó là những cái điểm yếu ChatGPT không phải là thứ mà có thể áp dụng những cái thông tin mới nhất. Họ hiểu ý không? Thông tin mới nhất, thực tế nhất, vào trong câu trả lời, mà nó thường là những cái thông tin data đã được pre-training. Cho nên chúng ta nên hỏi về những thứ mà bản chất mình nghĩ rằng là nó đã được training rồi.
About how much caffeine there's in one shot.
Ừm.
I don't think this information has changed too much. And number two, I think this information is extremely frequent on the internet. This kind of a question and this kind of information has occurred all over the place on the internet. And because there was so many mentions of it, I expect the model to have good memory of it in its knowledge. So there's no tool use, and the model, the zip file, responded that there's roughly 63 milligrams. Now, I'm not guaranteed that this is the correct answer. This is just its vague recollection of the internet. But I can go to primary.
Có một câu ông ấy nói rất là hay là các cái câu trả lời này đều đến từ internet, cho nên là đây chỉ là một hình dung của nó về thông tin của nó về internet trong hồi ức của nó thôi. Nó không phải là câu trả lời chắc chắn là chính xác, cho nên mọi người phải rất cảnh giác trong việc là lấy những thông tin từ ChatGPT hoặc những công cụ AI khác mà không double check nha.
Primary sources, and maybe I can look up, caffeine and Americano, and I could verify that, yeah, it looks to be about 63 is roughly right. And you can look at primary sources to decide if this is true or not. So I'm not strictly speaking guaranteed that this is true, but I think probably this is the kind of thing that ChatGPT would know. Here's an example of a conversation I had 2 days ago, actually. And there's another example of a knowledge-based conversation and things that I'm comfortable asking of ChatGPT with some caveats. So I'm a bit sick, I have runny nose, and I want to get meds that help with that. So it told me a bunch of stuff. I want my nose to not be runny. So I gave it a clarification based on what it said. And then it kind of gave me some of the things that might be helpful with that. And then I looked at some of the meds that I have at home and I said, does Dayquil or NyQuil work? And it went off and it kind of like went over the ingredients of Dayquil and NyQuil and whether or not they help mitigate runny nose. Now, when these ingredients are coming here, again, remember, we are talking to a zip file that has a recollection of the internet. I'm not guaranteed that these ingredients are correct. And in fact,
Một cái đoạn này không? Ông thậm chí còn không đảm bảo là vì đây chỉ là những hồi ức trong internet cũ thôi, không biết update mới thế nào, và ông còn đảm bảo trên thực tế là nó có chính xác như vậy không? Cho nên chúng ta phải để ý một vài thứ.
I actually took out the box and I looked at the ingredients and I made sure that NyQuil ingredients are exactly these ingredients. And I'm doing that because I don't always fully trust what's coming out
Không phải
here.
lúc nào
This
cũng
is just
100%
a
tin tưởng.
probabilistic, statistical recollection of the internet. But that said, conversations of Dayquil and NyQuil, these are very common meds. Probably there's tons of information about a lot of this on the internet, and this is the kind of things that the model have pretty good recollection of. So actually, these were all correct. And then I said, okay, well, I have NyQuil. How fast would it act roughly? And it kind of tells me. And then is acetaminophen basically a Tylenol? And it says yes. So this is a good example of how ChatGPT was useful to me. It is a knowledge-based query. This knowledge sort of isn't recent knowledge. This is all coming from the knowledge of the model. I think this is common information. This is not a high-stakes situation. I'm checking ChatGPT a little bit, but also this is not a high-stakes situation, so no big deal. So I popped a NyQuil, and indeed it helped.
Đó, ông ấy vẫn dùng ChatGPT như là một truy vấn kiến thức thôi. Nó không phải là thứ quyết định tất cả, cho nên mọi người phải để ý nhé, đừng bị phụ thuộc quá, thậm chí là về mặt thông tin phải để ý thêm rất nhiều để biết là mình nên thế nào, phải làm gì nha. Mọi người để ý đoạn này dùng thử.
That's roughly how I'm thinking.
Kiểu đừng bị phụ thuộc 100% với cả kiểu không double check mà tin 100% ấy, đặc biệt với những cái số liệu nhé. Tại vì bản chất nó vẫn là được train trên internet thôi, chứ nó không có cái gì là chuẩn xác 100% cả.
About what's coming back here. Okay, so at this point, I want to make two notes. The first note I want to make is that naturally, as you interact with these models, you'll see that your conversations are growing longer, right? Anytime you are switching topic, I encourage you to always start a new chat. When you start a new chat, as we talked about, you are wiping the context window of tokens and resetting it back to zero. If it is the case,
đó là lý do mà tớ lúc mà chỉ cho mọi người dùng ChatGPT luôn luôn chú ý là đối với các business khác nhau, chủ đề khác nhau, luôn luôn tạo cuộc hội thoại mới. Đừng hội thoại tất cả mọi thứ chung một context, nó sẽ rất làm cho nó càng ngày càng mơ hồ, câu trả lời của nó rất là không ổn, thực sự rất là không ổn.
that those tokens are not anymore useful to your next query, I encourage you to do this because these tokens in this window are expensive. And they're expensive in kind of like two ways. Number one, if you have lots of tokens here, then the model can actually find it a little bit distracting. So if this was a lot of tokens, the model might, this is kind of like the working memory of the model. The model might be distracted by all the tokens in the past when it is trying to sample tokens much later on. So it could be distracting and it could actually decrease the accuracy of the model and of its performance.
Đó, mọi người nghe thấy không? Điều này có thể làm giảm độ chính xác của mô hình. Cho nên là khi chúng ta dùng ChatGPT, hãy thiết lập cái memory một cách cực kỳ thông minh. Và đặc biệt đó là đưa các cái hoạch định các cái conversation, các cái cuộc hội thoại nó thực sự là rõ ràng, mà nó chỉ chuyên về một hoặc hai thứ thôi thì nó sẽ ổn hơn.
And number two, the more tokens are in the window, the more expensive it is by a little bit, not by too much, but by a little bit, to sample the next token in a sequence. So your model is actually slightly slowing down. It's becoming more expensive to calculate the next token, and the more tokens there are here. And so think of the tokens in the context window as a precious resource. Think of that as the working memory of the model, and don't overload it with irrelevant information, and keep it as short as you can. And you can expect that to work faster and slightly better.
Đó. Đây, cái phần này khá là quan trọng, dành cho những người mà dùng, prompt mà phải để ý, đó là tớ phải nói lại, đó là luôn luôn đừng cố gắng nói như là, tức là chúng ta phải tập cách trình bày cái thông tin và suy nghĩ của mình ra dạng text bằng cách prompt. Thì cái này khi mọi người prompt nhiều, mọi người mới học được, và càng ngày trình độ giải trình về ngôn ngữ của mọi người sẽ cao hơn. Như vậy mọi người sẽ giải trình chính xác hơn, ngắn gọn hơn, hợp lý hơn. Như vậy thì câu trả lời của AI tool nó mới không bị mơ hồ, không bị kiểu lung tung.
Of course, if the information actually is related to your task, you may want to keep it in there. But I encourage you to, as often as you can, basically start a new chat whenever you are switching topic. The second thing is that I always encourage you to keep in mind what model you are actually using. So here in the top left, we can drop down and we can see that we are currently using GPT-4o. Now, there are many different models of many different flavors, and there are too many actually, but we'll go through some of these over time. So we are using GPT-4o right now, and in everything that I've shown you, this is GPT-4o. Now, when I open a new incognito window, so if I go to chatgpt.com and I'm not logged in, the model that I'm talking to here, so if I just say hello, the model that I'm talking to here might not be GPT-4o. It might be a smaller version. Now, unfortunately, OpenAI does not tell me when I'm not logged in what model I'm using, which is kind of unfortunate. But it's possible that you are using a smaller, kind of dumber model. So if we go to the ChatGPT pricing page here, we see that they have 3 basic tiers for individuals, the free, plus, and pro. And in the free tier, you have access to what's called GPT-4o Mini. And this is a smaller version of GPT-4o. It is a smaller model with a smaller number of parameters. It's not going to be as creative, like its writing might not be as good. Its knowledge is not going to be as good. It's going to probably hallucinate a bit more, etc. But it is kind of like the free offering, the free tier. They do say that you have limited access to 4o and 03 Mini, but I'm not actually 100% sure. Like, it didn't tell us which model we were using, so we just fundamentally don't know. Now, when you pay for $20 per month, even though it doesn't say this, I think basically like they're screwing up on how they're describing this. But if you go to fine print, limit supply, we can see that the Plus users get 80 messages every 3 hours for GPT-4o. So that's the flagship, biggest model that's currently available as of today. That's available, and that's what we want to be using. So if you pay $20 per month, you have that with some limits. And then if you pay for $200 per month, you get the Pro, and there's a bunch of additional goodies as well as unlimited GPT-4o. And we're going to go into some of this because I do pay for Pro subscription.
Wow.
Now,
ông cũng dùng Pro, tớ cũng dùng Pro, và cũng phải thử xem ông ấy giải thích thế nào về việc bản Pro khác biệt bản Plus ấy. Và đặc biệt là những cái access mà kiểu Deep Research hay là One Pro, O1 Pro mode ấy. Bạn nào dùng $200 comment ở dưới tớ xem với nhá. Wow, cái video này đúng là chất lượng.
The whole takeaway I want you to get from this is be mindful of the models that you're using. Typically with these companies, the bigger models are more expensive to calculate. And so therefore, the companies charge more for the bigger models. And so make those trade-offs for yourself, depending on your usage of LLMs. Have a look at if you can get away with the cheaper offerings. And if the intelligence is not good enough for you and you're using this professionally, you may really want to consider paying for the top tier models that are available from these companies. In my case, in my professional work, I do a lot of coding and a lot of things like that. And this is still very cheap for me. So I pay this very gladly because I get access to some really powerful models that I'll show you in a bit. So yeah, keep track of what model you're using and make those decisions for yourself. I also want to show you that all the other LLM providers will all have different pricing tiers with different models at different tiers that you can pay for. So for example, if we go to Claude from Anthropic, you'll see that I am paying for the professional plan, and that gives me access to Claude 3.5 Sonnet.
Ôi, ông mua cả
And
Claude
if
luôn.
you are not paying for a pro plan, then probably you only have access to maybe Haiku or something like that. And so use the most powerful model that kind of like works for you. Here's an example of me using Claude a while back. I was asking for just travel advice. So I was asking for a cool city to go to, and Claude told me that Zermatt in Switzerland is really cool. So I ended up going there for a New Year's break following Claude's advice. But this is just an example of another thing that I find these models pretty useful for is travel advice and ideation and getting pointers that you can research further. Here we also have an example of gemini.google.com. So this is from Google. I got Gemini's opinion on the matter, and I asked it for a cool city to go to, and it also recommended Zermatt. So that was nice. So I like to go between different models and asking them similar questions and seeing what they think about. And for Gemini also on the top left, we also have a model selector. So you can pay for the more advanced tiers and use those models.
Ông cũng mua luôn bản
Same
Iran
thing
à?
goes for Grok, just released. We don't want to be asking Grok 2 questions because we know that Grok 3 is the
Grok
most
3.
advanced model. So I want to make sure that I pay enough and such that I have Grok 3 access. So for all these different providers, find the one that works best for you, experiment with different providers, experiment with different pricing tiers for the problems that you are working on. And that's kind of, and often I end up personally just paying for a lot of them and then asking all of them the same question. And I kind of refer to all these models as my LLM council. So they're kind of like the council of language models. If I'm trying to figure out where to go on a vacation, I will ask all of them. And so you can also do that for yourself if that works for you. Okay, the next topic I want to now turn to is that of thinking models, quote unquote. So we saw in the previous video that there are multiple stages of training. Pre-training.
Chúng cùng xem thử cái việc ông ấy giải thích nhé. Về cái những cái câu trả lời trong conversation trong cuộc hội thoại nhé.
Goes to supervised fine-tuning, goes to reinforcement learning.
Wow.
And reinforcement learning is where the model gets to practice on a large collection of problems that resemble the practice problems in the textbook. And it gets to practice on a lot of math and code problems. And in the process of reinforcement learning, the model discovers thinking strategies that lead to good outcomes. And these thinking strategies, when you look at them, they very much resemble kind of the inner monologue you have when you go through problem solving. So the model.
Tớ tìm được một cái từ rất là hay nhé, mọi người xem đọc lại.
They very much resemble kind of the inner monologue.
Cái từ được gọi là độc thoại nội tâm ấy. Đây chính là cái cách mà chúng ta hình dung về cái cách AI trả lời chúng ta, cũng như chúng ta hình dung được cái độc thoại nội tâm nó làm cho chúng ta tạo ra được cái prompt chuẩn nhất. Prompt nghĩa là như kiểu chúng ta đang giải thích một vấn đề với một người khác, cũng như chúng ta đề đặt câu hỏi với tool AI. Hay là độc thoại nội tâm.
Monologue you have when you go through problem solving. So the model will try out different ideas.
Ê, tôi phải nốt lại cái này mới được. Hay quá. Cái sự ảnh hưởng của độc thoại nội tâm.
It will backtrack, it will revisit assumptions, and it will do things like that. Now, a lot of these strategies are very difficult to hard code as a human labeler because it's not clear what the thinking process should be. It's only in the reinforcement learning that the model can try out lots of stuff, and it can find the thinking process that works for it with its knowledge and its capabilities. So this is the third stage of training these models. This stage is relatively recent, so only a year or two ago, and all of the different LLM labs have been experimenting.
Thường lúc mà tớ học AI ấy, tớ học những cái bài học AI hoặc là học những cái từ video này, tớ sẽ nghe một loạt từ đầu đến cuối. Sau đó tớ sẽ nghe lại, sau đó chúng ta sẽ chụp ảnh lại những cái mà dữ kiện chúng ta muốn đọc kỹ ấy, để mỗi ngày rảnh tớ sẽ mở cái bài file tớ đọc. Tớ học đến cái này là lesson 6 đấy. Chứ bình thường tớ đã hoàn thành 5 cái lesson của Google Cloud, tớ đã hoàn thành luôn chứng chỉ.
Experimenting with these models over the last year, and this is kind of like seen as a large breakthrough recently. And here we looked at the paper from DeepSeek that was the first to basically talk about it publicly. And they had a nice paper about incentivizing reasoning capabilities in LLMs via reinforcement learning. So that's the paper that we looked at in the previous video. So we now have to adjust our cartoon a little bit because basically what it looks like is our emoji now has this optional thinking bubble. And when you are using a thinking model, which will do additional thinking, you are using the model that has been additionally tuned with reinforcement learning. And qualitatively, what does this look like? Well, qualitatively, the model will do a lot more thinking, And what you can expect is that you will get higher accuracies, especially on problems that are, for example, math, code, and things that require a lot of thinking. Things that are very simple, like
Tớ khuyên mọi người là nên học một cái khóa basic về AI của Google Cloud. Google Cloud. Và nếu bạn nào quan tâm thì comment ở dưới tớ gửi cái đường link cho nhé. Tớ đã học qua 5 cái bài trên Google rồi. Google Cloud đúng không nhỉ? Tớ học lâu lắm rồi, tớ chả nhớ lắm. Từ từ tớ xem nào. Để tớ cho mọi người xem luôn. Đây, nó có một cái gọi là Machine Learning and Artificial Intelligence. Đây, mọi người học dùng tớ cái này nhá. Đây. Anh em nào học thì thứ nhất là nó sẽ cho mình một cái certification này. Đấy, mọi người học này. Nên thứ nhất là học cái này luôn nhé. Tại vì nó là cái hình dung cơ bản nhất về những cái liên quan đến Gen AI hay LLMs, học từ cái này luôn nha. Nên nhá.
might not.
Dùng tool AI và không học về AI thì cũng chỉ biết dùng tool không thì không ăn thua mọi người ạ. Không biết về định nghĩa, không biết về kiến thức thì cũng vậy à.
Actually benefit from
Nó sẽ
this,
không thể
but
nào
things that are
lên
actually
cái
deep and
kiểu
hard
advanced next
might
level
benefit
được.
a lot. And so, but basically what you're paying for it is that the models will do thinking, and that can sometimes take multiple minutes because the models will emit tons and tons of tokens over a period of many minutes, and you have to wait because the model is thinking just like a human would think. But in situations where you have very difficult problems, this might translate to higher accuracy. So let's take a look at some examples. So here's a concrete example when I was stuck on a programming problem recently. So something called the gradient check fails, and I'm not sure why, and I copy-pasted the model, my code. So the details of the code are not important, but this is basically an optimization of a multi-layer perceptron, and details are not important. It's a bunch of code that I wrote, and there was a bug because my gradient check didn't work, and I was just asking for advice. And GPT-4o, which is the flagship, most powerful model from OpenAI, but without thinking, just kind of like went into a bunch of things.
Có một cái phần mà đoạn này tớ phải nhấn mạnh cho mọi người thêm nhá, đó chính là cái phần mà các bạn dùng cái con ChatGPT O1 Pro hoặc những con mà có reasoning ấy, thì nó sẽ suy nghĩ, nó sẽ nói lên phần suy nghĩ của nó và nó sẽ tự suy nghĩ, tự xử lý. Còn đối với con 4o ấy, thường nó sẽ trả lời ngay, và việc trả lời ngay nó chỉ dựa trên những cái thông tin được dán nhãn thôi, tức là nó đã có sẵn rồi. Trong tập zip vừa rồi mà anh giải thích ấy, mọi người hiểu ý không? Cho nên cái phần thinking của nó không tốt bằng những con mà reasoning. Reasoning thì đợi lâu hơn. Anh đang dùng con 4o để trả lời thì khả năng cao chưa chắc nó đã giải quyết được vấn đề thì tốt đâu.
Things that it thought were issues or that I should double check, but actually didn't really solve the problem.
Đó.
Like all of the things that it gave me here are not the
Những vấn đề mà nó cung cấp cho tôi ở đây không phải là vấn đề cốt lõi. Đó là lý do vì sao nó ra một số con chuyên dành cho code như Claude phiên bản mới hay là con O1 Pro nha mọi người. Chú ý giúp tớ.
core issue of the problem. So the model didn't really solve the issue. And it tells me about how to debug it and so on. But then what I did was here in the dropdown, I turned to one of the thinking models. Now,
Đây, chúng ta có thể thấy là ghi rất là rõ đây. Thì phần O3 Mini 2 là with coding and logic thì có thể anh chuyển sang O3 O3 Mini 2 giúp anh ấy giải quyết vấn đề này dễ dàng hơn, hoặc là O1 Pro mode là ok.
For OpenAI, all of these models that start with O are thinking models. O1, O3 Mini, O3 Mini High, and O1 Pro mode are all thinking models. And they're not very good at naming their models, but that is the case. And so here they will say something like uses advanced reasoning or good at code and logics and stuff like that. But these are basically all tuned with reinforcement learning. And because I am paying for $200 per month, I have access to O1 Pro mode, which is best at reasoning. But you might want to try some of the other ones if depending on your pricing tier. And when I gave the same model, the same prompt to O1 Pro, which is the best at reasoning model, and you have to pay $200 per month for this one, then the exact same prompt, it went off and it thought for 1 minute. And it went through a sequence of.
Đây, ở bên cột bên phải nó sẽ là cái cột mà nó nghĩ thinking and reasoning. Cái đấy xin lỗi mọi người, tớ dùng cái này để chắn luôn cho mọi người đỡ phải nghĩ đây, nhưng mà sẽ bỏ qua cho mọi người xem thử qua. Ê, tự nhiên cái chuột của tớ này nó có vấn đề gì nhỉ? Đây, sẽ nghĩ detail là nó nghĩ gì, như thế nào, ra làm sao.
Thoughts, and OpenAI doesn't fully show you the exact thoughts. They just kind of give you little summaries of the thoughts. But it thought about the code for a while, And then it actually came back with the correct solution.
Không biết là cuối cùng thì cái giải pháp của O1 Pro đưa ra có ổn không, nhưng mà tớ nghĩ là chắc chắn là sẽ ổn hơn con 4o. Cho nên là lý do bây giờ tớ chấp nhận là chờ hơi lâu, nhưng trả lời của O1 Pro luôn luôn là ổn.
It noticed that the parameters are mismatched in how I pack and unpack them, and etc. So this actually solved my problem. And I tried out giving the exact same prompt to a bunch of other LLMs. So for example, Claude
Claude là cô tốt lắm này.
I gave Claude the same problem, and it actually noticed the correct issue and solved it. And it did that even with Sonnet, which is not a thinking model. So Claude 3.5 Sonnet, to my knowledge, is not a thinking model. And to my knowledge, Anthropic, as of today, doesn't have a thinking model deployed, but this might change by the time you watch this video.
Ui, vậy là đến nay Claude vẫn chưa ra một cái thinking model nào giống như kiểu reasoning, mà là đa phần là xử lý ngay, giống như con 4o thôi, không đi quá lâu.
But even without thinking, this model actually solved the issue. When I went to Gemini, I asked it, and it also solved the issue, even though I also could have tried the thinking model, but it wasn't necessary. I also gave it to Grok, Grok 3 in this case, and Grok 3 also solved the problem after a bunch of stuff. So it also solved the issue. And then finally, I went to perplexity.ai. And the reason I like Perplexity is because when you go to the model dropdown, one of the models that they host is this DeepSeek R1. So this has the reasoning with the DeepSeek R1 model, which is the model that we saw over here. This is the paper. So Perplexity just hosts it and makes it very easy to use. So I copy pasted it there and I ran it. And I think they really render it terribly, but down here, you can see the raw thoughts of the model, even though you have to expand them. But you see like, okay, the user is having trouble with the gradient check, and then it tries out a bunch of stuff. And then it says, but wait, when they accumulate the gradients, they're doing the thing incorrectly. Let's check the order. The parameters are packed as this, and then it notices the issue. And then it kind of like says, that's a critical mistake. And so it kind of like thinks through it, and you have to wait a few minutes, and then also comes up with the correct answer. So basically, long story short, what do I want to show you? There exists a class of models that we call thinking models. All the different providers may or may not have a thinking model. These models are most effective for difficult problems in math and code and things like that. And in those kinds of cases, they can push up the accuracy of your performance. In many cases, like if you're asking for travel advice or something like that, you're not going to benefit out of a thinking model. There's no need to wait for 1 minute for it to think about some destinations that you might want to go to. So for myself, I usually try out the non-thinking models because their responses are really fast. But when I suspect the response is not as good as it could have been, and I want to give the opportunity to the model to think a bit longer about it, I will change it to a thinking model, depending on whichever one you have available to you. Now, when you go to Grok, for example, when I start a new conversation with Grok, when you put the question here, like, hello, you should put something important here, you see here, think. So let the model take its time. So turn on think, and then click go. And when you click think, Grok under the hood switches to the thinking model. And all the different LLM providers will kind of like have some kind of a selector for whether or not you want the model to think, or whether it's okay to just like go with the previous kind of generation of the models. Okay, now the next section I want to continue to is to tool use. So far, we've only talked to the language model through text. And this language model is, again, this zip file in a folder. It's inert, it's closed off, it's got no tools. It's just a neural network that can emit tokens. So what we want to do now, though, is we want to go beyond that, and we want to give the model the ability to use a bunch of tools. And one of the most useful tools is an internet search. And so let's take a look at how we can make models use internet search. So for example, again, using concrete examples from my own life, a few days ago, I was watching White Lotus season 3, and I watched the first episode, and I love this TV show, by the way. And I was curious when the episode 2 was coming out. And so in the old world, you would imagine you go to Google or something like that, you put in like new episodes of White Lotus season 3, and then you start clicking on these links, and maybe you open a few of them or something like that, right? And you start like searching through it and trying to figure it out. And sometimes you luck out and you get a schedule. But many times you might get really crazy ads, there's a bunch of random stuff going on, and it's just kind of like an unpleasant experience, right? So wouldn't it be great if a model could do this kind of a search for you, visit all the web pages, and then take all those web pages, take all their content and stuff it into the context window, and then basically give you the response. And that's what we're going to do now. Basically, we have a mechanism or a way. We introduce a mechanism for the model to emit a special token that is some kind of a search the internet token. And when the model emits the search the internet token, the ChatGPT application, or whatever LLM application it is you're using, will stop sampling from the model, and it will take the query that the model gave. It goes off, it does a search, it visits web pages, it takes all of their text, and it puts everything into the context window. So now you have this internet search tool that.
Vậy là cái Internet Search của nó sẽ không đưa thông tin này vào trong tệp zip tổng thể của tổng data, hay còn gọi là cái data của zip của LLMs, mà là nó sẽ đưa toàn bộ thông tin từ Internet Search đấy vào trong cái context window, cái cột cái tổng kết cái ngữ cảnh đấy thôi. Cho nên là chúng ta mỗi lần mà cần cái thông tin gì mà ở cuộc hội thoại, chúng ta cần lại phải paste lại cái Internet Search đấy.
Itself
Nhưng mà nó sẽ kết hợp với những cái ngữ cảnh mà chúng ta đã prompt trước đấy rồi.
can also contribute tokens into our context window. And in this case, it would be like lots of internet web pages. And maybe there's 10 of them, and maybe it just puts it all together. And this could be thousands of tokens coming from these web pages, just as we were looking at them ourselves. And then after it has inserted all those web pages into the context window, it will reference back to your question as to, hey, when is this season getting released? And it will be able to reference the text and give you the correct answer. And notice that this is a really good example of why we would need internet search. Without the internet search, this model has no chance to actually give us the correct answer because, like I mentioned, this model was trained a few months ago. The schedule probably was not known back then. And so when White Lotus Season 3 is coming out is not part of the real knowledge of the model. And it's not in the zip file, most likely, because this is something that was presumably decided on in the last few weeks. And so the model has to basically go off and do internet search to learn this knowledge. And it learns it from the web pages, just like you and I would without it.
Ui, vậy là nếu mà các bạn để ý nhá, con ChatGPT 4.5 ấy, các bạn để ý nó có cái phần gọi là Review Research ấy, thì nó vừa trả lời giống con 4o và nó vừa Internet Search luôn. Cho nên câu trả lời của nó khá là hợp lý đối với những truy vấn thông tin mới nhất.
And then it can answer the question once that information is in the context window. And remember again that the context window is this working memory. So once we load the articles, once all of these articles, think of their text as being copy-pasted into the context window, now they're in a working memory and the model can actually answer those questions because it's in the context window. So basically, long story short, don't do this manually, but use tools like Perplexity as an example. So perplexity.ai had a really nice sort of LLM that was doing internet search. And I think it was like the first app that really convincingly did this. More recently, ChatGPT also introduced a search button. It says search the web. So we're going to take a look at that in a second.
Trong quá trình mà tớ nói về các cái video AI và kể cả Perplexity, tớ đã nói mọi người là top 3 cái tool mà tớ luôn luôn có phải mua và mọi người nên mua, đó là một, đó là con ChatGPT. Vì nó là LLM đã quá lâu, quá mới, quá nổi tiếng rồi và data nó update nó rất là vì nó đầu tiên mà thời gian phát triển nó dài hơn. Thứ hai là Perplexity, bởi con này là con LLM mà chuyên về searching và cách mà nó trình bày những cái dạng search, hoặc là chúng ta search từ social, chúng ta search từ nhiều yếu tố khác. Cho nên là Perplexity là một công cụ mà đúng là cũng không thể thiếu được mọi người ạ. Và cái thứ ba tớ luôn luôn khuyên mọi người đó là con Notion AI, đó là một cái hub information để chúng ta trình bày list những cái thông tin, list prompt để sau này chúng ta học những cái là AI automation hoặc là AI agent để input vào đấy nó rất là dễ.
For now, when are new episodes of White Lotus Season 3 getting released? You can just ask. And instead of having to do the work manually, we just hit enter. And the model will visit these web pages, it will create all the queries, and then it will give you the answer. So it just kind of like did a ton of the work for you. And then you can, usually there will be citations, so you can actually visit those web pages yourself, and you can make sure that these are not hallucinations from the model, and you can actually like double check that.
Mọi người có thể xem lại cái video về Perplexity của tớ trong kênh tớ nhé.
This is actually correct, because it's not in principle guaranteed. It's just, something that may or may not work. If we take this, we can also go to, for example, ChatGPT, say the same thing. But now, when we put this question in, without actually selecting search, I'm not actually 100% sure what the model will do. In some cases, the model will actually like know that this is recent knowledge and that it probably doesn't know, and it will create a search. In some cases, we have to declare that we want to do the search. In my own personal use, I would know that the model doesn't know, and so I would just select search. But let's see first, let's see if what happens. Okay, searching the web, and then it prints stuff, and then it cites. So the model actually detected itself that it needs to search the web because it understands that this is some kind of a recent information, etc. So this was correct.
Còn ChatGPT nó còn search ra cả cái trailer kìa mọi người. Ở dưới YouTube luôn.
Alternatively, if I create a new conversation, I could have also selected search because I know I need to search. Enter. And then it does the same thing, searching the web, and that's the result. So basically, when you're using these LLM, look for this. For example, Grok. Excuse me. Let's try Grok. Without selecting search. Okay, so the model does some search, just knowing that it needs to search.
Có một điểm đặc biệt của em Grok, mọi người nhìn thấy nó search xong nó search luôn trên Xbox luôn, Twitter đấy mọi người ạ. 5 post trên X luôn. Đâm ra là thông tin nó tràn đấy.
And gives you the answer.
Video hay đó.
So basically, let's see what Claude does.
Claude.
You see, so Claude doesn't actually have the search tool available. So it will say, as of my last update in April 2024, this last update is when the model went through pre-training. And so Claude is just saying, as of my last update, the knowledge cutoff of April 2024, it was announced, but it doesn't know. So Claude doesn't have the internet search integrated as an option and will not give you the answer. I expect that this is something that Anthropic might be working on. Let's try Gemini and let's see what it says. Unfortunately, no official release date for White Lotus Season 3 yet. So Gemini 2.0 Pro Experimental does not have access to internet search and doesn't know. We could try some of the other ones like 2.0 Flash. Let me try that. Okay, so this model seems to know, but it doesn't give citations. Oh wait, okay, there we go. Sources and related content. So you see how 2.0 Flash actually has the internet search tool, but I'm guessing that the 2.0 Pro, which is the most powerful model that they have, this one actually does not have access. And in here, it actually tells us 2.0 Pro Experimental lacks access to real-time info and some Gemini features. So this model is not fully wired with internet search. So long story short, we can get models to perform Google searches for us, visit the web pages, pull in the information to the context window, and answer questions. And this is a very, very cool feature. But different models, possibly different apps, have different amount of integration of this capability. And so you have to be kind of on the lookout for that. And sometimes the model will automatically detect that they need to do search. And sometimes you're better off telling the model that you want it to do the search. So when I'm doing GPT-4o and I know that this requires a search, you probably want to tick that box. So that's search tools. I wanted to show you a few more examples of how I use the search tool in my own work. So what are the kinds of queries that I use? And this is fairly easy for me to do because usually for these kinds of cases, I go to Perplexity just out of habit, even though ChatGPT today can do this kind of stuff as well, as do probably many other services as well. But I happen to use Perplexity for these kinds of search queries. So whenever I expect that the answer can be achieved by doing basically something like Google search and visiting a few of the top links, and the answer is somewhere in those top links, whenever that is the case, I expect to use the search tool. And I come to Perplexity. So
tớ nghĩ là Perplexity vẫn là công cụ mà searching AI ok nhất, nhưng mọi người cũng đừng quên đó là Gemini là có khu data, có nhóm data của Google, cho nên tớ nghĩ là trong tương lai cũng chưa biết đường nào mà lần nữa nè anh em nhỉ, cũng chưa biết đường nào mà lần thật luôn. Okay.
Here are some examples. Is the market open today? And this was on President's Day. I wasn't 100% sure. So Perplexity understands what it's today. It will do the search and it will figure out that on President's Day, this was closed. Where's White Lotus Season 3 filmed? again, this is something that I wasn't sure that a model would know in its knowledge. This is something niche, so maybe there's not that many mentions of it on the internet. And also this is more recent, so I don't expect a model to know by default. So this was a good fit for the search tool. Does Vercel offer PostgreSQL database? So this was a good example of this because this kind of stuff changes over time, and the offerings of Vercel, which is a company, may change over time, and I want the latest. And whenever something is latest or something changes, I prefer to use the search tool, so I come to Perplexity. What is the Apple launch tomorrow, and what are some of the rumors? So again, this is something recent. Where is the Singles Inferno Season 4 cast? Must know. So this is, again, a good example because this is very fresh information. Why is the Palantir stock going up? What is driving the enthusiasm? When is Civilization 7 coming out?
Vậy là chúng ta thấy cách anh ấy dùng Perplexity hay vãi luôn. Tức là chúng ta thấy ngay cả việc mà hỏi về cổ phiếu. Có chuyện gì vậy? Tại sao nó tăng? Tin đồn là gì? Đó.
Exactly. This is an example also, like, has Brian Johnson talked about the toothpaste he uses? And I was curious basically like what Brian does. And again, it has the two features. Number one, it's a little bit esoteric, so I'm not 100% sure if this is at scale on the internet and would be part of like knowledge of a model. And number two, this might change over time, so I want to know what toothpaste he uses most recently. And so this is a good fit, again, for a search tool. Is it safe to travel to Vietnam? This can potentially change over time. And then I saw a bunch of stuff on Twitter about...
Tớ xem lại cái câu trả lời an toàn để gọi là du lịch đến Việt Nam chứ. Việt Nam là siêu an toàn luôn. Anh ơi, Việt Nam là nước nào an toàn với Việt Nam anh ơi.
This can potentially change over time. And then I saw a bunch of stuff on Twitter about USA.
Anh em có vào kênh chính thức comment giúp tớ nhé. Kênh của anh ơi, Việt Nam ủng hộ em cái.
ID, and I wanted to know kind of like what's the deal. So I searched about
From Vietnam we love anh em ạ.
That, and then you can kind of like dive in a bunch of ways here. But this use case here is kind of along the lines of, I see something trending and I'm kind of curious what's happening, like what is the gist of it? And so I very often just quickly bring up a search of like what's happening and then get a model to kind of just give me a gist of roughly what happened. Because a lot of the individual tweets or posts might not have the full context just by itself. So these are examples of how I use a search tool. Okay, next up, I would like to tell you about this capability called deep research. And this is fairly recent, only as of like a month or two.
Deep research là một trong những cái tính năng mà phải nói là cái tính ứng dụng của nó khá là rộng, và có lẽ là thông qua video này chúng ta sẽ cực kỳ chú ý để xem nó ứng dụng thế nào, tại vì là số lượng text nó sản sinh ra được tổng hợp deep research mà nó quá nhiều, và tôi biết rằng là những người mà dùng quen AI sẽ có bị thao tác là lười đọc, cho nên là nếu quá dài mọi người sẽ hơi lười đọc ạ.
Ago, but I think it's incredibly cool and really interesting and kind of went under the radar for a lot of people, even though I think it shouldn't have. So when we go to ChatGPT pricing here, we notice that deep research is listed here under Pro. So it currently requires $200 per month. So this is the top tier.
Top tier.
However, I think it's incredibly cool. So let me show you by example in what kinds of scenarios you might want to use it. Roughly speaking, deep research is a combination of internet search and thinking, and rolled out for a long time. So the model will go off.
Vậy là deep research là kết hợp của internet search và thinking.
And it will spend tens of minutes doing what deep research. And the first sort of company that announced this was ChatGPT as part of its Pro offering very recently, like a month ago. So here's an example. Recently, I was on the internet buying supplements, which I know is kind of crazy, but Brian Johnson has this starter pack and I was kind of curious about it. And there's this thing called Longevity Mix, right? And it's got a bunch of health actives. And I want to know what these things are, right? And of course, like CA-AKG, like what the hell is this? Boost energy production for sustained vitality. Like, what does that mean? So one thing you could, of course, do is you could open up Google search and look at the Wikipedia page or something like that and do everything that you're kind of used to. But deep research allows you to basically take an alternate route, and it kind of like processes a lot of this information for you and explains it a lot better. So as an example, we can do something like this. This is my example prompt. CA-AKG is one of the health actives in Brian Johnson's blueprint at 2.5 grams per serving. Can you do research on CAKG? Tell me about why it might be found in the longevity mix, its possible efficacy in humans or animal models, its potential mechanism of action, any potential concerns or toxicity or anything like that. Now, here I have this button available to me, and you won't unless you pay $200 per month right now.
$200 một tháng mới được nha mọi
But I
người.
can turn on deep research. So let me copy paste this and hit go. And now the model will say, okay, I'm going to research this. And then sometimes it likes to ask clarifying questions before it goes off. So a focus on human clinical studies, animal models, or both. So let's say both. Specific sources, all sources, I don't know. A comparison to other longevity compounds, not needed. Comparison, just AKG.
Trả lời
We
các
can
câu
be
hỏi
pretty
để
brief.
mà
The
bắt
model
đầu
understands.
deep research.
And we hit go. And then, okay, I'll research the AKG, starting research. And so now we have to wait for probably about 10 minutes or so. And if you'd like to click on it, you can get a bunch of preview of what the model is doing on a high level. So this will go off and it will do a combination of, like I said, thinking and internet search. But it will issue many internet searches. It will go through lots of papers. It will look at papers and it will think and it will come back 10 minutes from now. So this will run for a while. Meanwhile, while this is running, I'd like to show you equivalents of it in the industry. So inspired by this, a lot of people were interested in cloning it. And so one example is, for example, Perplexity. So Perplexity, when you go to the model dropdown, has something called deep research. And so you can issue the same queries here, and we can give this to Perplexity. And then Grok as well has something called deep search instead of deep research. But I think that Grok's deep search is kind of like deep research, but I'm not 100% sure. So we can issue Grok deep search as well. Grok 3, deep search, go. And this model is going to go off as well. Now, I think, where's my ChatGPT? So ChatGPT is kind of like maybe a quarter done. Perplexity is going to be done soon. Okay, still thinking. And Grok is still going as well. I like Grok's interface the most. It seems like, okay, so basically it's looking up all kinds of papers, WebMD, browsing results, and it's kind of just getting all of this. Now, while this is all going on, of course, it's accumulating a giant context window, and it's processing all that information, trying to kind of create a report for us. So key points, what is CAKG and why is it in the longevity mix? How is it associated to longevity, etc.? And so it will do citations and it will kind of like tell you all about it. And so this is not a simple and short response. This is a kind of like almost like a custom research paper on any topic you would like. And so this is really cool and it gives a lot of references potentially for you to go off and do some of your own reading and maybe ask some clarifying questions afterwards. But it's actually really incredible that it gives you all these like different citations and processes the information for you a little bit. Let's see if Perplexity finished. Okay, Perplexity is still researching, and ChatGPT is also researching. So let's briefly pause the video, and I'll come back when this is done. Okay, so Perplexity finished, and we can see some of the report that it wrote up. So there's some references here and some basically description. And then ChatGPT also finished, and it also thought for 5 minutes, looked at 27 sources, and produced a report. So here it talked about research in worms, Drosophila in mice, and in human trials that are ongoing, and then a proposed mechanism of action, and some safety and potential concerns, and references, which you can dive deeper into. So usually in my own work right now, I've only used this maybe for like 10 to 20 queries so far, something like that. Usually I find that the ChatGPT offering is currently the best. It is the most thorough, it reads the best, it is the longest, it makes most.
Đấy anh em nghe anh nói nhá, có thể không phải là vì anh ấy là cựu co-founder đâu, nhưng mà anh ấy là người mà nói rất là rõ là cái deep search và những cái mà anh ấy dùng để anh cảm thấy ChatGPT là ok.
Sense when I read it. And I think the Perplexity and the Grok are a little bit shorter and a little bit briefer and don't quite get into the same detail as the deep research from Google, from ChatGPT right now. I will say that everything that is given to you here, again, keep in mind that even though it is doing research and it's pulling stuff in, there are no guarantees that there are no hallucinations here. Any of this can be hallucinated at any point in time. It can be totally made up, fabricated, misunderstood by the model. So that's why these citations are really important. Treat this as your first draft. Treat this as papers to look at. But don't take this as definitely true. So here what I would do now is I would actually go into these papers and I would try to understand, is ChatGPT understanding it correctly? And maybe I have some follow-up questions like
Anh ấy vẫn nói rằng là chúng ta không thể coi nó là đúng tuyệt đối 100% được, nhưng mà nó sẽ là một cái thứ để mà chúng ta tham khảo, đọc qua, thậm chí là đi sâu vào nếu muốn đọc kỹ hơn từ từng website một. Tôi nghĩ là vẫn nên có một cái mindset dùng AI theo kiểu như này, chứ không bị phụ thuộc nhiều là rất có vấn đề.
etc. So you can do all that. But still incredibly useful to see these reports once in a while to get a bunch of sources that you might want to descend into afterwards. Okay, so just like before, I wanted to show a few brief examples of how I've used deep research. So for example, I was trying to change a browser because Chrome was not, Chrome upset me. And so it deleted all my tabs. So I was looking at either Brave or Arc, and I was most interested in which one is more private. And basically ChatGPT compiled this report for me, and this was actually quite helpful. And I went into some of the sources, and I sort of understood why Brave is basically TLDR significantly better. And that's why, for example, here I'm using Brave because I've switched to it now. And so this is an example of basically researching different kinds of products and comparing them. I think that's a good fit for deep research. Here I wanted to know about a life extension in mice. So it kind of gave me a very long reading. But basically, mice are an animal model for longevity, and different labs have tried to extend it with various techniques. And then here, I wanted to explore LLM labs in the USA, and I wanted a table of how large they are, how much funding they've had, etc. So this is the table that it produced. Now, this table is basically hit and miss, unfortunately. So I wanted to show it as an example of a failure.
Về một số cái LLM Research Lab thì founded OpenAI 2015. Số liệu đến 2022, 2023 là khoảng 770 nhân sự. Total funding 13 tỷ và Microsoft 49%. Really? Okay.
I think some of these numbers, I didn't fully check them, but they don't seem way too wrong. Some of this looks wrong. But the big omission I definitely see is that XAI is not here, which I think is a really...
Tớ dòng mó, tớ phải check thử xem là Microsoft 49 stack OpenAI. Really? Ôi, đúng rồi mọi người ạ. Return cap is rich.
Major omission. And then also, conversely, Hugging Face should probably not be here because I asked specifically about LLM labs in the USA. And also, Eleuther AI, I don't think should count as a major LLM lab due to mostly its resources. And so I think it's kind of a hit and miss. Things are missing. I don't fully trust these numbers. I'd have to actually look at them. And so, again, use it as a first draft. Don't fully trust it. Still very helpful.
Mọi người nhớ nha, hãy coi nó như là bản nháp đầu tiên, không hoàn toàn tin tưởng, nhưng mà nó khá ổn. Chúng ta có thể check lại được từ nguồn nha. Tại vì phần lớn vẫn chỉ là lấy từ tư liệu trên internet và được viết lại bằng những bài báo rồi.
So what's really happening here that is interesting is that we are providing the LLM with additional concrete documents that it can reference inside its context window. So the model is not just relying on the knowledge, the hazy knowledge of the world through its parameters and what it knows in its brain. We're actually giving it concrete documents. It's as if you and I reference specific documents like on the internet or something like that while we are kind of producing some answer for some question. Now, we can do that through an internet search or like a tool like this, but we can also provide these LLMs with concrete documents ourselves through a file upload. And I find this functionality pretty helpful in many ways. So as an example, let's look at Claude because they just released Claude 3.7 while I was filming this video. So this is a new Claude model that is now the state of the art. And notice here that we have thinking mode now as of 3.7. And so normal is what we looked at so far, but they just released extended best for math and coding challenges. And what they're not saying, but it's actually true under the hood probably, most likely, is that this was trained with reinforcement learning. in a similar way that all the other thinking models were produced. So what we can do now is we can upload documents that we wanted to reference inside its context window. So as an example, there's this paper that came out that I was kind of interested in. It's from Art Institute, and it's basically a language model trained on DNA. And so I was kind of curious. I mean, I'm not from biology, but I was
Nếu như không lầm thì đây là thông tin của một con người gọi Evo2. Em này là được đào tạo bởi train bởi DNA nha mọi người. Và nó có thể xử lý và tạo ra những thứ kể cả là DNA, và thông tin này là đến từ NVIDIA đấy.
So I was kind of curious what this is. And this is a perfect example of what LLMs are extremely good for, because you can upload these documents to the LLM and you can load this PDF into the context window and then ask questions about it and basically read the document together with an LLM and ask questions of it. So the way you do that is you basically just drag and drop. So we can take that PDF and just drop it here.
Xin lỗi mọi người.
This is about 30 megabytes. Now, when Claude gets this document, it is very likely that they actually discard a lot of the images and that kind of information. I don't actually know exactly what they do under the hood, and they don't really talk about it, but it's likely that the images are thrown.
Đây cũng là phần mà tôi khá là suy nghĩ khi mà mình vứt một cái file PDF, Excel, something like CSV vào thì gần như một số cái hình ảnh thì nó bỏ qua luôn, nó chỉ đọc text thôi thì phải. Thì không biết là câu trả lời của anh này thế nào, anh này cũng có cảm giác như vậy, tại vì mình không thể biết được là cụ thể nó có đọc cái hình này không. Đó.
Thrown away, or if they are there, they may not be as well
Hoặc nếu có thể chúng có thể không được hiểu rõ như bạn và tôi có thể hiểu chúng.
understood as you and I would
Nghĩa là chúng ta nhìn chúng ta sẽ hiểu hơn là con AI nó đọc.
understand them potentially. And it's very likely that what's happening under the hood is that this PDF is basically converted to a text file, and that text file is loaded into the token window.
Có thể sủi đầu. Cái này thì các bạn dùng AI chắc có lẽ là hình dung được đúng không? Là khi mà upload một cái file lên, nó sẽ tự động convert PDF thành text, toàn bộ text thành đó, xong vứt ném cái đó vào trong context window, có thể dùng một cái prompt nào đó để phân tích, cũng như là sẵn sàng cho việc là summarize lại, hoặc là lấy đó làm cái context window để chúng ta làm cái câu, làm cái data hub để chúng ta hỏi dựa trên này so sánh.
And once it's in the token window, it's in the working memory, and we can ask questions of it. So typically when I start reading papers together with any of these LLMs, I just ask for, can you give me a summary? Summary of this paper. Let's see what Claude 3.7 says.
Nhưng Claude luôn là cái tool mà đọc file tôi yên tâm nhất rồi.
Okay,
dài à?
Exceeding the length limit of this chat. Oh God. Really? Oh, damn. Okay, well, let's try ChatGPT.
Okay. Thử ChatGPT nào.
Can you summarize this paper? And we're using GPT-4o, and we're not using thinking, which is okay. We can start by not thinking.
Thinking thì đâu có phải file ở đâu đúng không?
Reading documents. Summary of the paper, genome modeling and design across all domains of life. So this paper introduces Evo2, large-scale biological foundation model. And then key features.
Tính năng chính đấy.
And so on. So I personally find this pretty helpful. And then we can kind of go back and forth. And as I'm reading through the abstract and the introduction, etc., I am asking questions of the LLM. And it's kind of like making it easier for me to understand the paper. Another way that I like to use this functionality extensively is when I'm reading books. It is rarely ever the case anymore that I read books just by myself. I always involve an LLM to help me read a book.
Anh này khá là giống tớ, tại vì là tớ cũng hay đọc sách bằng ChatGPT, tức là nhờ nó tóm tắt, hoặc là thậm chí là đưa cho một cách dễ hiểu dựa trên những cái bản tính suy nghĩ và lối suy nghĩ của mình. Đó, các bạn mua ebook xong các bạn lấy file PDF phệt vào trong ChatGPT, bảo là summarize endgame.
So a good example of that recently is The Wealth of Nations, which I was reading recently. And it is a book from 1776 written by Adam Smith, and it's kind of like the foundation of classical economics. And it's a really good book, and it's kind of just very interesting to me that it was written so long ago, but it has a lot of modern day kind of like, it's just got a lot of insights that I think are very timely even today.
Okay, có vẻ như là nó dừng lại rồi. Chưa, vẫn đang record, hết hồn.
So the way I read books now, as an example, is you basically pull up the book, And you have to get access to like the raw content of that information. In the case of Wealth of Nations, this is easy because it is from 1776. So you can just find it on Wealth Project Gutenberg as an example. And then basically find the chapter that you are currently reading. So as an example, let's read this chapter from book 1. And this chapter I was reading recently, and it kind of goes into the division of labor and how it is limited by the extent of the market. Roughly speaking, if your market is very small, then people can't specialize, and specialization is what is basically huge. Specialization is extremely important for wealth creation because you can have experts who specialize in their simple little task. But you can only do that at scale because without the scale, you don't have a large enough market to sell to your specialization. So what we do is we copy paste this book, this chapter at least. This is how I like to do it. We go to say Claude, and we say something like, we are reading The Wealth of Nations. Now remember, Claude has knowledge of the Wealth of Nations, but probably doesn't remember exactly the content of this chapter. So it wouldn't make sense to ask Claude questions about this chapter directly because it probably doesn't remember what this chapter is about, but we can remind Claude by loading this into the context window. So we're reading The Wealth of Nations. Please summarize this chapter to start. And then what I do here is I copy paste. Now in Claude, when you copy paste, they don't actually show all the text inside the text box. They create a little text attachment when it is over some size.
Bây giờ tớ mới để ý nhá, tớ cứ nghĩ là bình thường tớ sẽ tải cái file đó qua PDF, sau đó phệt qua text hoặc là up cái file PDF lên, nhưng mà anh này copy text trên PDF và khi mà mình paste và plot thì nó sẽ là dạng text paste text. Ấy, học được mới, học rồi sẽ mua Claude.
And so we can click enter. And we just kind of like start off. Usually I like to start off with a summary of what this chapter is about, just so I have a rough idea. And then I go in and I start reading the chapter. And at any point we have any questions, then we just come in and just ask our question. And I find that basically going hand in hand with LLMs dramatically increases my retention, my understanding of these chapters. And I find that this is especially the case when you're reading, for example, documents from other fields, like for example, biology, or for example, documents from a long time ago, like 1776, where you sort of need a little bit of help of even understanding what the basics of the language. Or for example, I would feel a lot more courage approaching a very old text that is outside of my area of expertise. Maybe I'm reading Shakespeare or I'm reading things like that. I feel like LLMs make a lot of reading very dramatically more accessible than it used to be before, because you're not just right away confused. You can actually kind of go slowly through it and figure it out together with the LLM in hand. So I use this extensively, and I think it's extremely helpful. I'm not aware of tools, unfortunately, that make this very easy for you. Today, I do this clunky back and forth. So literally, I will find the book somewhere, and I will copy paste stuff around, and I'm going back and forth, and it's extremely awkward and clunky. And unfortunately, I'm not aware of a tool that makes this very easy for you. But obviously what you want is, as you're reading a book, you just want to highlight a passage and ask questions about it. This currently, as far as I know, does not exist. But this is extremely helpful. I encourage you to experiment with it, and don't read books alone. Okay, the next very powerful tool that I now want to turn to is the use of a Python interpreter, or basically giving the ability to the LLM to use and write computer programs. So instead of the LLM giving you an answer directly, it has the ability now to write a computer program and to emit special tokens that the ChatGPT application recognizes as, hey, this is not for the human. This is basically saying that whatever I outputted here is actually a computer program. Please go off and run it and give me the result of running that computer program. So it is the integration of the language model with a programming language here, like Python. So this is extremely powerful. Let's see the simplest example of where this would be used and what this would look like. So if I go to ChatGPT and I give it some kind of a multiplication problem, let's say 30 times 9 or something like that, then this is a fairly simple multiplication. And you and I can probably do something like this in our head, right? Like 30 times 9, you can just come up with the result of 270, right? So let's see what happens. Okay, so LLM did exactly what I just did. it calculated the result of the multiplication to be 270. But it's actually not really doing math. It's actually more like almost...
Đoạn này hay, cái mindset đoạn này hay. Khi mà chúng ta là 30 nhân 9 thực sự là con LLM trả lời không dựa vào việc nó tính toán, và nó dựa vào trí nhớ nhiều hơn, là nó dựa vào thông tin internet. Mọi người nói về nó, mọi người đã có người nói về nó rồi chứ không phải là tính toán.
memory work, but it's easy enough to do in your head. So there was no tool use involved here. All that happened here was just the zip file doing next token prediction and gave the correct result here.
Chúng ta phải để ý cái mindset này, không đừng nghĩ là nó có thể tính toán được. Nó là về liên quan đến trí nhớ.
In its head. The problem now is, what if we want something more complicated? So what is this times this? And now, of course, this, if I asked you to calculate this, you would give up instantly because you know that you can't possibly do this in your head. And you would be looking for a calculator. And that's exactly what the LLM does now too. And OpenAI has trained ChatGPT to recognize problems that it cannot do in its head and to rely on tools instead. So what I expect ChatGPT to do for this kind of a query is to turn to tool use. So let's see what it looks like. Okay, there we go. So what's opened up here is what's called the Python interpreter. And Python is basically a little programming language. And instead of the LLM telling you directly what the result is, the LLM writes a program, and then not shown here are special tokens that tell the ChatGPT application to please run the program. And then the LLM pauses execution. Instead, the Python program runs, creates a result, and then passes this result back to the language model as text. And the language model takes...
Vậy là nó sẽ lấy kết quả từ Python, sau đó là nó chuyển đổi cái đó sang dạng text, và nó chuyển đổi text đó sang cái câu trả lời của chúng ta. Ví dụ như the research of đó.
Over and tells you that the result of this is that. So this is tool use, incredibly powerful, and OpenAI has trained ChatGPT to kind of like know in what situations to lean on tools, and they've taught it to do that by example. So human labelers are involved in curating data sets that kind of tell the model by example in what kinds of situations it should lean on tools and how. But basically, we have a Python interpreter, and this is just an example of multiplication, but this is significantly more powerful. So let's see what we can actually do inside programming languages. Before we move on, I just wanted to make the point that unfortunately, you have to kind of keep track of which LLMs that you're talking to have different kinds of tools available to them, because different LLMs might not have all the same tools. And in particular, LLMs that do not have access to the Python interpreter or a programming language, or are unwilling to use it, might not give you correct results in some of these harder problems.
Mọi người ơi, đứng dậy tí nào mọi người ơi. Tôi em ngồi với anh là 1 tiếng rồi anh ạ. Em mà đứng dậy em khởi động tí nào. Ây da, mọi người học tiếp này. Ây da, học được cái plot rồi này. Ây da, rồi xem anh ấy ứng dụng Python vào trong lập trình như nào này.
So as an example, here we saw that ChatGPT correctly used a programming language and didn't do this in its head. Grok 3 actually, I believe, does not have access to a programming language like a Python interpreter. And here, it actually does this in its head and gets remarkably close. But if you actually look closely at it, it gets it wrong. This should be 120 instead of 060. So Grok 3 will just hallucinate through this multiplication and do it in its...
Ôi, vậy là Grok bị sai à? Đúng không? Get it wrong này.
So Grok 3 will just get it wrong. This should be 120. But if you actually look closely at it, it gets it wrong. This should be 120 instead of 060. So Grok 3 will... It gets it wrong. This should be really close. And here, it actually does this in its head and gets remarkably close. But if you actually look closely at it...
120 chứ mà không 60 đúng không?
It gets it wrong. This should be 120 instead of 0.
Đó, mọi người chú ý dùng tool chú ý nha. Nhiều khi những con số nó không đúng đâu. Tham chiếu nó bị ảo giác đấy.
60. So Grok 3 will just hallucinate through this multiplication and do it in its head and get it wrong, but actually like remarkably close. Then I tried Claude, and Claude actually wrote, in this case, not Python code, but it wrote JavaScript code. But JavaScript is also a programming language and gets the correct result. Then I came to Gemini and I asked 2.0 Pro, And Gemini did not seem to be using any tools. There's no indication of that. And yet it gave me what I think is the correct result, which actually kind of surprised
Và là riêng Gemini là không dùng. Đối với con ChatGPT thì dùng Python, đối với con Claude thì dùng Java. Nhưng mà ChatGPT thì không dùng, nhưng mà vẫn ra kết quả chính xác.
me. So Gemini, I think, actually calculated this in its head correctly. And the way we can tell that this is, which is kind of incredible, the way we can tell that it's not using
Hoặc có thể nó dùng mà mình không biết được nhỉ?
tools is we can just try something harder. What is, we have to make it harder for it. Okay, so it gives us some result, and then I can use my calculator here, and it's wrong.
Đúng không? Đúng không? Sai này.
Right? So this is using my MacBook Pro calculator. And it's not correct, but it's like remarkably close, but it's not correct. But it
Sai mà trả lời nhanh nhưng sai.
will just hallucinate
Ảo
the
giác
answer.
thực sự.
So I guess like my point is, unfortunately, the state of the LLMs right now is such that different LLMs have different tools available to them, and you kind of have to keep track of it. And if they don't have the tools available, they'll just do their best, which means that they might hallucinate a result
Vậy là nó vẫn có thể tạo ra một cái kết quả ảo giác chứ nó không nói là nó không biết. Cho nên chúng ta nên dùng nhiều tool thì sẽ ok hơn.
for you. So that's something to look out for. Okay, so one practical setting where this can be quite powerful is what's called ChatGPT Advanced Data Analysis. And as far as I know, this is quite unique to ChatGPT itself. And it basically gets ChatGPT to be kind of like a junior data analyst who you can kind of collaborate with. So let me show you a concrete example without going into the full detail. So first we need to get some data that we can analyze and plot and chart, etc. So here in this case, I said, let's research OpenAI evaluation as an example. And I explicitly asked ChatGPT to use the search tool because I know that under the hood, such a thing exists. And I don't want it to be hallucinating data to me. I want it to actually look it up and back it up. And create a table where each year we have the valuation. So these are the OpenAI evaluations over time. Notice how in 2015, it's not applicable. So the valuation is like unknown. Then I said, now plot this, use log scale for y-axis. And so this is where this gets powerful. ChatGPT goes off and writes a program that plots the data over here. So it creates
Wow. Và nó dùng Python để tạo nên cái valuation over time theo dạng biểu đồ á. Vãi thật.
program that plots the
Ê, học được cái prompt của ông này hay phết đấy. Now plot this, you log scale for y-axis.
So this is where this gets powerful. ChatGPT goes off and writes a program that plots the data over here. So it created a little figure for us, and it sort of ran it and showed it to us. So this can be quite nice and valuable because it's a very easy way to basically collect data, upload data in a spreadsheet, visualize it, etc. I will note some of the things here. So as an example, notice that we had NA for 2015, but ChatGPT, when it was writing the code, and again, I would always encourage you to scrutinize the code, it put in 0.1 for 2015. And so basically it implicitly assumed that it made the assumption here in code that the valuation at 2015 was 100 million. And because it put in 0.1. And it's kind of like did it without telling us. So it's a little bit sneaky. And that's why you kind of
Nó lấy lúc tại vì là ở cái thông tin câu trả lời hỏi trên thì nó ghi là NA, không có tư liệu, không có thông tin gì. Nhưng mà ở dưới phần Python thì nó giả định nó là 0,1. Nó là chúng ta biết nó hơi lén lút. Hay đấy. Hay mọi người ạ, nhưng mà tớ mải đọc cái sắp quá, cổ nó cứ
have to pay attention a little bit to the code. So I'm familiar with the code and I always read it. But I think I would be hesitant to potentially recommend the use of these tools if people aren't able to like read it and verify it a little bit for themselves. Now, fit a trend line and extrapolate until the year 2030. Mark the expected valuation in 2030. So it went off and it basically did a linear fit. And it's using SciPy's curve fit. And it did this and came up with a plot. And it told me that the valuation based on the trend in 2030 is approximately 1.7 trillion, which sounds amazing, except here I became suspicious because I see that ChatGPT is telling me it's 1.7 trillion. But when I look here at 2030, it's printing 20271.7b. So its extrapolation when it's printing the variable is inconsistent with 1.7 trillion. this makes it look like that valuation should be about 20 trillion. And so that's what I said, print this variable directly by itself. What is it? And then it sort of like rewrote the code and gave me the variable itself. And as we see in the label here, it is indeed 2271, etc. So in 2030, the true exponential trend extrapolation would be a valuation of 20 trillion.
20 trillion.
So I was like, I was trying to
21,27
confront
trillion.
ChatGPT and I was like, you lied to me, right? And it's like, yeah, sorry, I messed up. So I guess I like this example because number one, it shows the power of the tool in that it can create these figures for you. And it's very nice. But I think number two, it shows the trickiness of it, where, for example, here it made an implicit assumption.
Tôi check cái. Tự nhiên quên đấy. Trillion tức là khoảng trillion, 1 trillion là 1.000 tỷ. 27.000 tỷ đô.
And here it actually told me something. It told me just the wrong, it hallucinated 1.7 trillion. So again, it is kind of like a very, very junior data analyst. It's amazing that it can plot figures, but you have to kind of still know what this code is doing. And you have to be careful and scrutinize it and make sure that you are really watching very closely, because your junior analyst is a little bit absent-minded and not quite right all the time. So really powerful, but also be careful with this. I won't go into full details of advanced data analysis, but there were many videos made on this topic. So if you would like to use some of this in your work, then I encourage you to look at some of these videos. I'm not going to go into the full detail. So a lot of promise, but be careful. Okay, so I've introduced you to ChatGPT and advanced data analysis, which is one powerful way to basically have LLMs interact with code and add some UI elements like showing of figures and things like that. I would now like to introduce you to one more related tool, and that is specific to Claude, and it's called artifacts. So let me show you by example what this is. So you have a conversation with Claude, and I'm asking, generate 20 flashcards from the following text. And for the text itself, I just came to the Adam Smith Wikipedia page, for example, and I copy-pasted this introduction here. So I copy-pasted this here and asked for flashcards, and Claude responds with 20 flashcards. So, for example, when was Adam Smith baptized? On June 16th, etc. When did he die? What was his nationality, etc. So once we have the flashcards, we actually want to practice these flashcards. And so this is where I continue the conversation and I say, now use the artifacts feature to write a flashcards app to test these flashcards. And so Claude goes off and writes code for an app that basically formats all of this into flashcards. And that looks like this. So what Claude wrote specifically was this code here. So it uses a React library and then basically creates all these components. It hard codes the Q&A into this app. And then all the other functionality of it. And then the Claude interface basically is able to load these React components directly in your browser. And so you end up with an app. So when was Adam Smith baptized? And you can click to reveal the answer. And then you can say whether you got it correct or not. When did he die? What was his nationality, etc. So you can imagine doing this, and then maybe we can reset the progress or shuffle the cards, etc. So what happened here is that Claude wrote us a super duper custom app just for us right here. And typically what we're used to is some software engineers write apps, they make them available, and then they give you maybe some way to customize them or maybe to upload flashcards. Like, for example, in the Anki app, you can import flashcards and all this kind of stuff. This is a very different paradigm because in this paradigm, Claude just writes the app just for you and deploys it here in your browser. Now, keep in mind that a lot of apps you will find on the internet, they have entire backends, etc. There's none of that here. There's no database or anything like that. But these are like local apps that can run in your browser, and they can get fairly sophisticated and useful in some cases. So that's Claude Artifacts. Now, to be honest, I'm not actually a daily user of artifacts. I use it once in a while. I do know that a large number of people are experimenting with it, and you can find a lot of artifact showcases because they're easy to share. So these are a lot of things that people have
Hay
developed,
quá.
various
Chúng ta có một vài cái mẫu của Claude làm với artifact. Tôi sẽ nốt lại luôn nha. Hay quá mọi người ạ. Từ từ. Bài học nên chúng ta phải nốt lại. Trang web sẽ là Claude artifact.com. Hay. Quá hay.
timers and games and things like that. But the one use case that I did find very useful in my own work is basically the use of diagram generation.
Diagram của Claude này trông cũng được đấy chứ nhỉ? Không đến độ quá xấu đâu nhỉ? Ok, viết thêm nhé. Tạo thử diagram với Claude.
So as an example, let's go back to the book chapter of Adam Smith that we were looking at. What I do sometimes is we are reading The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. I'm attaching chapter 3 and book 1. Please create a conceptual diagram of this chapter. And when Claude hears conceptual diagram of this chapter, very often it will write code that looks like this. And if you're not familiar with this, this is using the Mermaid library to basically create or define a graph. And then this is plotting that mermaid diagram. And so Claude analyzes the chapter and figures out that, okay, the key principle that's being communicated here is as follows, that basically the division of labor is related to the extent of the market, the size of it. And then these are the pieces of the chapter. So there's the comparative example of trade and how much easier it is to do on land and on water, and the specific example that's used. And that geographic factors actually make a huge difference here. And then the comparison of land transport versus water transport and how much easier water transport is. And then here we have some early civilizations that have all benefited from basically the availability of water transport and have flourished as a result of it because they support specialization. So it's, if you're a conceptual kind of like visual thinker, and I think I'm a little bit like that as well, I like to lay out information and like as like a tree like this, and it helps me remember what that chapter is about very easily. And I just really enjoy these diagrams and like kind of getting a sense of like, okay, what is the layout of the
Nói chung cái diagram này dành cho những người mà thích cái kiểu trình bày kiểu như này ấy. Chắc là tớ nghĩ nhiều người, tớ là không phải là quá thích kiểu dạng trình bày như này, nhưng mà ít nhất là đọc và vắn tắt cũng sẽ nhớ theo dạng
argument? How is it arranged spatially and so on? And so if you're like me, then you will definitely enjoy this. And you can make diagrams of anything, of books, of chapters, of source codes, of anything really. And so I specifically find this fairly useful. Okay, so I've shown you that LLMs are quite good at writing code. So not only can they emit code, but a lot of the apps like ChatGPT and Claude and so on have started to like partially run that code in the browser. So ChatGPT will create figures and show them, and Claude artifacts will actually like integrate your React component and allow you to use it right there inline in the browser. Now, actually, majority of my time personally and professionally is spent writing code. But I don't actually go to ChatGPT and ask for snippets of code because that's way too slow. Like ChatGPT just doesn't have the context to work with me professionally to create code.
Vậy là không nên dùng ChatGPT để tạo code. Tôi nốt lại luôn. Ông có cảm giác không ổn. Ông là co-founder mà. Cựu co-founder mà. Nên là chúng ta tin ông đi.
And the same goes for all the other LLMs. So instead of using features of these LLMs in a web browser, I use a specific app, and I think a lot of people in the industry do as well. And this can be multiple apps by now, VS Code, Windsurf, Cursor, etc. So I like to use Cursor currently. And this is a separate app you can get for your, for example, MacBook. And it works with the files on your file system. So this is not...
Đây là một số dạng các cái website mà liên quan tới làm mấy cái front-end, back-end. Cursor, mình mua chưa ta? Cái này như là mình có mua đâu, đâu có làm đâu. Cursor, Visual, Love Available. Cursor, cho mọi người xem qua nhé, mọi người xem trước. Cursor, đây. Dùng có thể dùng Claude để mà tạo code hoặc dùng content chat thẳng với nó cũng được. Nhưng thực tế tớ nghĩ là ví dụ như là với cái hub information từ con OpenAI, con ChatGPT ấy, thì nó sẽ lấy đúng cái ý tưởng của mình và cái mong muốn của mình sang cursor thì nó sẽ ok hơn. Dùng nó tạo prompt.
This is not some kind of a web page you go to. This is a program you download, and it references the files you have on your computer, and then it works with those files and edits them with you. So the way this looks is as follows. Here I have a simple example of a React app that I built over a few minutes with Cursor. And under the hood, Cursor is using Claude 3.7 Sonnet. So under the hood, it is calling the API of Anthropic and asking Claude to do all of this stuff. But I don't have to manually go to Claude and copy paste chunks of code around. This program does that for me and has all of the context of the files in the directory and all this kind of stuff. So the app that I developed here is a very simple tic-tac-toe as an example. And Claude wrote this in probably a minute, and we can just play. X can win. Or we can tie. Oh wait, sorry, I accidentally won. You can also tie. And I'd just like to show you briefly, this is a whole separate video of how you would use Cursor to be efficient. I just want you to have a sense that I started from a completely new project, and I asked the Composer app here, as it's called, the Composer feature, to basically set up a new React repository, delete a lot of the boilerplate, please make a simple tic-tac-toe app, and all of this stuff was done by Cursor. I didn't actually really do anything except for like write 5 sentences. And then it changed everything and wrote all the CSS, JavaScript, etc. And then I'm running it here and hosting it locally and interacting with it in my browser. So that's Cursor. It has the context of your apps, and it's using Claude remotely through an API without having to access the web page. And a lot of people, I think, develop in this way at this time. So, and these tools have become more and more elaborate. So in the beginning, for example, you could only like say change like, oh, Control K, please change this line of code to do this or that. And then after that, there was a Control L, Command L, which is, oh, explain this chunk of code. And you can see that there's going to be an LLM explaining this chunk of code. And what's happening under the hood is it's calling the same API that you would have access to if you actually did enter here. But this program has access to all the files, so it has all the context. And now what we're up to is not Command K and Command L. We're now up to Command I, which is this tool called Composer. And especially with the new agent integration, the Composer is like an autonomous agent on your code base. It will execute commands. It will change all the files as it needs to. It can edit across multiple files. And so you're mostly just sitting back and you're giving commands. And the name for this is called vibe coding, a name with that I think I probably minted. And vibe coding just refers to letting, giving control to Composer and just telling it what to do and hoping that it works. Now, worst comes to worst, you can always fall back to the good old programming because we have all the files here. We can go over all the CSS and we can inspect everything. And if you're a programmer, then
Về bản chất thì nếu các bạn nào mà không biết về code thì vẫn có thể làm được, nhưng mà vẫn nên biết, tại vì vẫn phải double check với những cái giao diện code cũ cơ bản như bình thường ấy. Cái này tớ không dùng code nhiều nên là cũng chỉ xem qua cho biết thôi.
in principle, you can change this arbitrarily. But now you have a very helpful assistant that can do a lot of the low-level programming for you. So let's take it for a spin briefly. Let's say that when either X or O wins, I want confetti or something. And let's just see what it comes up with.
Ok, test thử nào.
Okay, I'll add
Hiệu ứng
a confetti
hoa
effect when a player wins the game. It wants me to run React Confetti, which apparently is a library that I didn't know about. So we'll just say, okay. It installed it, and now it's going to update the app. So it's updating app.tsx, the TypeScript file, to add the confetti effect when a player wins. And it's currently writing the code, so it's generating. And we should see it in a bit. Okay, so it basically added this chunk of code, and a chunk of code here, and a chunk of code here. And then we'll also add some additional styling to make the winning cells stand out.
Kinh nhỉ, code tự động quyết hết.
Okay, it's still generating. Okay, and it's adding some CSS for the winning cells. So honestly, I'm not keeping full track of this. It imported React Confetti. This all seems pretty straightforward and reasonable, but I'd have to actually like
thêm
really
sound
dig
effect
in.
luôn kìa. Woo!
Okay, it wants to add a sound effect when a player wins, which is pretty ambitious, I think. I'm not actually 100% sure how it's going to do that because I don't know how it gains access to a sound file like that. I don't know where it's going to get the sound file from. But every time it saves a file, we actually are deploying it. So we can actually try to refresh and just see what we have right now. So also it added a new effect. You see how it kind of like fades in, which is kind of cool. And now we'll win.
Ah!
Okay. Didn't actually expect that to work.
Hay phết.
This is really elaborate now. Let's play again. Whoa.
Còn biển xanh xanh.
Okay. Oh, I see. So it actually paused and it's waiting for me. So it wants me to confirm the command. So make public sounds. I had to confirm it explicitly. Let's create a simple audio component to play victory sound. Sound/victory mp3. The problem with this will be the victory.mp3 doesn't exist. So
Phải
I
tải
wonder
cái
what it's
sao
going
đấy
to do.
về. Không làm gì có sao sẵn trong máy.
It's downloading it.
Cho nên nó mới
It wants to
Aeroplay
download
sau
it
này.
from somewhere. Let's just go along with it. Let's add a fallback in case the sound file doesn't exist.
Tự làm game luôn các thứ thôi.
In this case, it actually does exist. And yep, we can git add. And we can basically create a git commit out of this. Okay, so the composer thinks that it is done. So let's try to take it for a spin.
Có sao rồi. Từng.
Yeah, pretty impressive. I don't actually know where it got the sound file from.
Download về rồi mà.
I don't know where this URL comes from, but maybe this just appears in a lot of repositories and sort of Claude kind of like knows about it. But I'm pretty happy with this. So we can accept all, and that's it. And then as you can get a sense of, we could continue developing this app. And worst comes to worst, if we can't debug anything, we can always fall back to standard programming instead of vibe coding. Okay, so now I would like to switch gears again. Everything we've talked about so far had to do with interacting with the model via.
Mọi người ơi, chắc là tớ sẽ dừng cái video tại đây, tớ sợ là quá dài đấy. Tớ sẽ làm phần 1 và phần 2 nhé. Nếu mà phần 2 mọi người ủng hộ tớ sẽ làm luôn. Đằng nào mà cũng xem cái video này và nó sẽ có Vietsub ở đây. Cho nên nếu ủng hộ phần 2 hãy comment ở dưới, ấn like và đăng ký kênh giúp tớ. Cảm ơn rất nhiều. Mỏi hết cả lưng rồi.